to order this special meeting of the Rappahannock County Planning Commission, and it's an auspicious date. It's Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022. If you would please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks very much. We have a very targeted agenda, but still an exciting one. And so I would just now entertain a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. Oh.
I second.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kohler and Ms. Ritter. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Great, thank you very much. We'll jump right into the only focus of our meeting tonight, and that's a kickoff discussion with three members of the Berkley Group, and their names are Kelly Davis, Rebecca Cobb, and Chris Musso. And as we've been talking about for several months, we've enlisted the help of the Berkley Group to augment our own Rappahannock County staffing resources to try to accelerate and handle in a comprehensive and organized way an updating, revamping, reorganization of our zoning and subdivision ordinances, including the processes by which we handle different types of permits in Rappahannock County. And I should state up front that during our initial call with the Berkley Group, Mr. Curry, Mr. Light, and I emphasized to them really the character and the nature of Rappahannock County, and I wanted them to all appreciate the fact that this is truly a no-growth county with very restrictive zoning, and that we want to keep our county the way it is. And everyone loves to talk about no stoplights and things like that, but it goes much deeper than that. So I'm anxious for the Berkley Group folks to hear from all of you who've been on the Planning Commission for years and have a lot of local knowledge, insight, and wisdom. And I think in the end, the purpose of tonight's meeting is really to get a sense here on the Planning Commission of this diagnostic effort that will kick off the Berkley Group's overall service offering to us. And with that, I think I will just leave it to the Berkley Group team to walk us through what they want to cover tonight and what they want to hear from us. And we're grateful you're able to join us by video conference. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And everyone can still hear me okay?
Perfectly clear, thank you.
All right, great. So I do have a presentation tonight that I'll run through, and I'll just share screen. And let's see. Take me a minute to orient myself. It's been a while since I've shared screen on Zoom. So let's see. Everyone seeing the presentation?
Yep.
All right. So yes, thank you for having us tonight to kind of kick off or do sort of the second portion of the kickoff and get started talking about your zoning and subdivision ordinance or ordinances. And so this evening, I'm just going to go through quickly a little bit about the project purpose, what we're doing, just kind of orient ourselves for this project, talk a little bit about how the schedule is going to work, and then also get into some examples of what we typically find when we're doing diagnostics, as well as a quick review of some of our initial findings, partially from our starting to read your ordinance, but also from our first kickoff that was mentioned a moment ago. And then we'll have some question time where we can hear from all of you on anything else that you want to add, you want to bring to light, any questions, that sort of thing. So getting started, project purpose. When we're doing these diagnostics, we really like to dive in, look at your zoning subdivision ordinances for several things. We're going to be looking for compliance with state code. We want to make sure that you are complying with the Code of Virginia, and we will make suggestions when we feel like there's something missing, or maybe it's not, quite on par with code. We also are going to look for clarity, making sure the text is very clear and everyone can read it and understand what's being said. We will look at modernization and see where there might be areas to modernize zoning and subdivision issues. And a lot of times that comes through in definitions and uses, those types of things. We'll also look at implementation of your comprehensive plan. We know you've updated that recently, and so we want to make sure you can implement the things that you have created in there. Your vision for your community can be implemented through your zoning and subdivision ordinance. So we'll take a look at those things. And then usability, just making sure that anyone in your community can pick it up and find what they're looking for. They can understand it. So a lot of times that includes incorporating tables and things like that instead of just paragraphs of data. So then in terms of how this particular project will sort of flow is right now we're in the investigation phase, the first phase. We've had kickoff with staff, and we're in the PC work session with you all. And then second phase is going to be content development. And that's when Berkley Group is going to be writing the zoning ordinance diagnostic, subdivision diagnostic, and then a land use policy report. And those things are going to be happening in March and April. And then after that will be the review phase. And that's when we'll come back to you all to review the diagnostics and land use report and let you ask any questions about those things, as well as then we'll also go to the board and do the same thing, present the information and answer any questions that you might have. So that will be happening in May and June. Now I'll look at some of the things that we typically find when we're doing these diagnostics. As I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at state code. And so that's a big thing that we find is compliance issues with state code. And we will let you know what areas you're excelling in and which areas you need to improve in. And that includes optional provisions. State code does have some things that it says, a locality may use this or can do something. And so we'll take a look at those and see if we think it might be a good fit for Rappahannock, and let you know if you should be incorporating those or considering incorporating those items. Also, what we typically find is conflicts in text or complicated, lengthy processes, language that's maybe hard to interpret. And so we try to point those things out and give you some fixes for those items. Another common thing is going to be definitions and uses. Communities are changing. You've just set your vision, and so you want to make sure you're sticking with that vision for your community. And so you need to assess, are our uses appropriate? Are definitions appropriate to handle these uses? It's also very modern times, and so lots of new uses are coming in, and you want to make sure that you are addressing those things as well. And so we'll take a look at all of those, as well as we'll typically recommend some consolidation, modernization, where that needs to happen, as well as looking at the administration of your ordinance, making sure there's clear application processes, clear enforcement processes, all of those things, they're easy to utilize. Some initial findings, particular to what we've heard and what we've seen so far for your ordinances. We did have kickoff, and what we heard in that kickoff is a little bit about procedures and usability. that there's request for review of the processes, particularly with Planning Commission public hearings. There seems to be, some questions as to, should we have public hearings? How can we make this a smooth process? And so we'll take a look at that, as well as there was some questions about the density requirements. Density is listed both in your zoning ordinance and in your subdivision ordinance. And what we heard is that that's a little bit cumbersome and hard to navigate and interpret those things. So we will take a look at that. And then also uses and standards was a big topic, needing to modernize uses, make sure that the unique uses for your community is being addressed, as well as shifting uses in terms of permissions, that maybe some things need to be special exception versus special permit, or some things might need to be shifted to by right. Some of the uses that we heard in particular were agritourism, tourist homes, and utility scale solar, all kind of more modern uses that lots of communities are having challenges with. And so we'll take a look at those and address those standards and give you some feedback on those. And then in terms of just our initial review, reading through your ordinances, a couple of things that we would notice and point out is organization, supply content, and user-friendly order. One thing that happens in every community is you've got an ordinance that was adopted, 30, 40 years ago, and you've amended and changed a few things. And when you do that, sometimes it gets a little disjointed and it's a little hard to find things. And so a little reorganization probably would be helpful, as well as including some tables. For example, your parking standards are all in text. And so it would be nice to have that in a table, make that a little more user-friendly. Your uses and standards, there did seem to be in your matrix a little hard to really understand when it's a special exception or when it's a special permit. One particular use in one district is provided lots of different ways. And so understanding that distinction would be helpful for us as we move forward. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then also consistent standards in terms of, maybe some of these uses that are special exception or special permit could be by right uses that have some specific standards with them. And so we did see a few uses that might be able to apply some of that. And so that's a very, very fast rundown of what we've heard so far, but I want to leave the predominant amount of time this evening to hear from you and then build on what we've heard. And so if you have your agendas with you or looking at the screen, it's on here as well, but 5A is where we'll start with questions. I wanted to give you questions ahead of time so you could be thinking about it, maybe have some answers prepared. But just first question, how well does the zoning ordinance support and align with the adopted comprehensive plan? So feel free, anyone, to jump in there and tell us what you think.
Great, thanks a lot for that intro. And I should mention that Gary Light is participating via Zoom. So Gary, just make sure to speak up if and when you want to jump in. Why don't we keep this pretty informal? I don't know if anyone just wants to kick off this discussion on the comp plan question, which I think is a pretty good starting place.
I've just asked that if you do want to interact with the folks on Zoom, you probably should speak towards a microphone, which are placed all on the table. Well, good. The comprehensive plan is not important. Let's move on.
All right, I'll pick up when somebody else is. Thank you very much for this. And
Go ahead and introduce yourself too. We didn't do that at the outset. So.
I'm Mary Catherine. She's probably not their figure. And do you want to do intros first?
Just introduce yourself when you speak. Yeah, you can just go ahead.
So I would say that generally speaking, our ordinance, is consistent with the comprehensive plan. I know there are some probably areas that we might want to look at. And I know there are some, but anyway, generally speaking, I think it jives with it. I do know that and I think these are mentioned throughout, and I'll just jump in here. I know that our telecommunications ordinance has areas that are not, at least last time I looked, consistent with certain provisions of the Virginia Code. And so that is something that I imagine we need to look at. But I guess for me, the main thing I'd ask, and I think from what your materials show, you've already gotten this, that whatever we do is to bear in mind that Rappahannock County is Rappahannock and it's not other counties. So we have a different set of goals, a different set of agendas, a different location for our gateway community, the Shenandoah National Park, probably the most visible and arguably the most important gateway community. We're small. We have 267 square miles versus Fauquier, which has 651 square miles versus Fairfax, which has over 400 square miles, et cetera. So we can do things. We have, I believe, count them, 2 main highways. That's it, going through the county. So I'm pretty sure you already have been well versed in our desire to stay a rural community. But I would like to reiterate that any suggestions and recommendations that you all provide, we'll bear that in mind.
Good.
I'm just new to the planning commission, but a couple of things.
Go ahead and introduce.
I'm Steph Ritter, and I'm also on the BZA. And our ordinance is not all that easy to use. It's poorly indexed, and there are different requirements in different sections, so that you have to put a bunch of them together. I'm sure Michelle must drive the zoning administrator crazy. And then the other thing is, in our comprehensive plan, it says that we want growth around the villages, but zoning isn't necessarily well adapted to that growth. And I think that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, that's
Right. Is there anyone else?
this is Kier Whitson. I just wanted to say something that dovetails with Steph's. We might have mentioned to you in our initial kickoff call that we did have one request for rezoning of a RR5 parcel to rezone it to R2, and that drew a lot of attention from our community, and that goes right to the heart of what Ms. Ritter just said, which is we have this statement in our comprehensive plan that really drives a lot of our land use policy and theory, which is growth in and around the villages. And this parcel that was subject to the rezoning request was around the village of Sperryville. Ultimately, it was denied, but I think it's a good case study from which we might be able to draw some lessons as we think through really how to make sure that our zoning ordinance is properly and in a detailed way in line with what our comp plan calls for. So I think that was a recent practical case study that we can all reflect upon in this context of what does growth in and around the villages mean, or development. Sorry.
Yep. This is Gary. I wanted to chime in on, I think, a broader level point about this support and alignment question. Historically, at least until maybe a year or two ago, there was a pretty concerted effort to keep the planning, the comprehensive plan, pretty broad in terms of, policies, objectives, goals, and not get into anywhere close to the level of detail that is typically found in an ordinance. I think if you read through the plan, you will notice that that is by and large the case in a lot of areas. And then you run into, I believe we did both the telecommunications section and the renewable energy section, if I'm not mistaken, but I know we did the telecommunication, but what you're going to find in there, in my view, is that it reads much more like ordinance language. So, to me, part of this, what I would hope to gain from this is perhaps some educated perspective on what support and alignment means. Obviously, these are different documents, and I, for one, have been concerned that if we get in too much specificity in the comprehensive plan, we find ourselves, we're going to be tempted to find ourselves, in debates about, very detailed comparisons, whereas in my view, a better approach is to have the comprehensive plan, recognize it as a more general, visionary, broad strokes document, and leave those more detailed policies and provisions for the zoning ordinance. So I think others might argue that that means that they would lack alignment. If by alignment, you might mean they should say the same thing, which I'm not sure that that's what people actually think. But I think we struggle with the relationship between these documents. And I think that should be part of what I hope we improve upon through this exercise.
Really well said. Rick or Brian? Al?
No, I think Gary covered what I wanted to say, that we've got a little bit too much detail in the comprehensive plan, and we've added things to the comprehensive plan that are probably not even mentioned in the zoning.
Okay.
This is Brian Schulin. Before the meeting, I was talking to Rick, and I was glad to see that Rebecca mentioned it in her introduction, that I find tables quite useful. And when we're talking about the sign ordinance, I want to talk to Michelle, because she's going to have a cheat sheet that she's going to pull out that we don't have. No one else has. Everyone should have that cheat sheet. I look forward to putting everything on tables. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that goes to the point of clarity and something that's easy to enforce.
Usability.
Right. Al?
Alvin Henry. Many years ago, this is one thing y'all need to keep in mind, and a little history here, is that many years ago, when the zoning designations were placed on the land over the county, the godfathers at that time in the county realized that the commercial word was a bad word, the I word standing for industrial was a bad word, and things like this were they recognized that it had to be someplace in the county, but two things happened. There was very little of it placed around in the county, and also some of the placements where it was placed were physically, geographically almost prohibited from using that space for that use. So it was another effort, whether I think it was probably intentional at that time, to limit the industrial and commercial uses in the county. And if you look at the amount of acreage that's zoned appropriately in those categories in the county, I think you'll find it's a very little amount. And moving forward, I've been on the planning commission more than a decade, and our last county administrator was also the zoning administrator, John McCarthy. And he once made a statement to me that I will not forget, and it stands in my mind a whole lot when we have applications, in that more and more people all the time are looking to do businesses in the county, whether it's operating out of their houses, doing whatever that business may be, and recognizing that there's not commercial and industrial spaces necessarily to do these spaces, that they're looking to use their property that may be zoned ag or some form of residential to accommodate some of these uses, and they come into us for permits. And basically this is an outlet to relieving some of this pressure of people that want to do business in Rappahannock in a small way. And and John reminded me that this has to be like a relief valve to accommodate some of these uses, because of what's available out there today is very limited and really restricted. So when y'all do this, I just want you to kind of keep this in mind that, we need to do good planning, but it's not about necessarily eliminating uses that may be permitted, special use or whatever permit.
Good.
I would just piggyback on that and say, I think your observations, Berkley Group, that we make a lot of use of special exceptions and special permits and conditional uses really builds on the point Al's making, that, rather than sort of open the gates and then kind of worry about what might come in, the kind of approach was, well, let's not open it up categorically, but let's allow some of these things to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And that really is deeply embedded in the kind of zoning strategies or tactics and ordinances that we have in place. A lot of things are, well, it depends, and that I think gives us a good flexibility that we want. But I think it also leaves us open to kind of criticism because, there's more judgment involved in those kinds of conditions than there would be if it was very clear from a a zone or explicit rules based requirement. So anyway, sorry.
Really good.
It's a great segue to this second point of it depends. That process needs to be really nailed down and reviewed carefully in the ordinance for special use permits, special exceptions. And so if we're so reliant on it depends, then the process that we work through to determine whether a use is appropriate for a parcel, a given parcel, in a given circumstance, needs to be very plain so we're protected from a potential legal suit if maybe a property owner doesn't like the answer that was given to them.
Right.
And I'll chime in there that I think that's right. Everybody's raised really good points. And I think the special exception versus special use, and sometimes we don't have any standards in there. So that is worth looking at as a general thing. I'd like to keep in mind the distinction though between the comprehensive plan and the ordinance, as some have pointed out. In the comprehensive plan, we're looking more generally at things like, do we have all the villages zoned exactly the way we want them? And that's not really what we're doing per se in this ordinance review, I don't think. I think we're looking at consistency with the code, and there's nothing wrong with having discussions around that. But again, land use planning writ broad is more our comprehensive plan. And so I would hope what we're focusing on here is, again, the consistency with the code, readability. Sometimes sometimes we could improve on that, and for sure some of our process things.
All right, we, for the most part, stuck to the first question. Should we, maybe I could just ask the Berkley Group, do you want to move on to the second question about processes, or do you have any follow-up questions on what you've heard so far?
No, I think I have an understanding for the first question. And I would just say in terms of for clarity for you guys, when we're looking at comparing your ordinance to your comprehensive plan, what we do is look at your strategies. And if you have strategies that are geared towards land use, then we want to make sure you're working towards and not against those strategies. So it's sort of, high level, just looking to see, is your zoning ordinance working along with your comprehensive plan and helping you achieve the vision? Or is it a little, different? Maybe you've got some, a few specific things in your comp plan that there's a contradiction in your zoning ordinance or something like that. So that's kind of the basic thought there. But yes, let's talk about the procedures and what's your thoughts on those, and are applications coming in with sufficient detail? Sometimes, you feel like you're expecting one thing and then an application comes and it doesn't have, everything that you need. And one way to ensure it does is to put that in your ordinance, what you're expecting, as well as having a very transparent process so that the applicant knows, what to expect and what's the next step. So talk to me a little bit about that and what your experiences are.
Well, I can say there's been a lot of, or some consternation among members of the Planning Commission. We have this practice now of for special use and special exception permit applications that all come through the Planning Commission, a preliminary review process, which is a meeting-based review of the application, which then leads to potentially setting a date for a public hearing. And I think I'll let other people speak to this, but the frustration has been, do we need a preliminary review? And do we also, and then have that separate and apart from a decision to hold a public hearing? That's one issue. And then we have this bifurcated process that I think we talked about when we had our initial organizational call, and that is within Rappahannock County, special exception permits go Planning Commission, Board of Supervisors, and the special use permits go Planning Commission, Board of Zoning Appeals. So those are at least some sort of themes that I think would be useful for us to talk about tonight, but I'll leave it to others to chime in.
I'm Steph Rader again, and I'm also on the BZA. And it's my impression that it's really burdensome on citizens to have to come first to the Planning Commission and have their application approved, then possibly have a public hearing before the Planning Commission, then go before the BZA where there's another public hearing. And if a citizen has hired an attorney, one thing is it's going to get really expensive. Mm-hmm. And in addition to it's so burdensome, it would seem to me that maybe making sure that bringing an application before the Planning Commission to make sure it's complete, and then going forward to the BZA on the special use permit where there can be a public hearing would be more efficient and more conducive to an easier time for the citizens and a less expensive time.
So I would just want to add quickly to that with all due respect, I would not at all agree with that. I think the flip side of that is as the Planning Commission being the more deliberative body tasked with making a recommendation, in my view, if there's going to be one public hearing, it should be with the Planning Commission, because of course the BZA would have the benefit of seeing the results and seeing the product of the earlier public hearing with the Planning Commission. Whereas if the public hearing is delayed until the BZA meeting or the supervisors meeting, the Planning Commission is faced with making a recommendation without the input from the public, which I'm very opposed to.
Gary Curry just typed it in, and obviously the Berkley Group folks know this, that the Code of Virginia mandates the BZA or the Board of Supervisors to hold a public hearing, and basically allows the Planning Commission to provide input to that process if you so deem appropriate. And we take that many steps further here in Rappahannock County and basically say for every SUP or SE, it's appropriate for the Planning Commission to review the package and then possibly have a second public hearing. So you could not do away with the final public hearing. That's Code of Virginia required.
Alvin Henry here. We've been struggling. We used to not to struggle with this issue, but over the last year or two, we've really struggled on the number of hearings and the process, and maybe the appropriate way to do this, since the final decisions were left with the Board of Supervisors and also with the BCA, is simply for us to be a fact-finding group and hold interview the applicant, ask questions and this and that, and put together an information package for the BZA and the supervisors to use. Therefore, and if the BZA is going to be making the final decision, they have to have a public hearing to ask the questions that have not been asked, or they need to ask in the same way with the Board of Supervisors. And we would simply hopefully provide a package that would whittle down the number of issues that they have to address that we didn't cover. And moving on to another item within this same situation here, we have always strived not to be a bureaucracy here when it comes to an application process. I know other counties around us, particularly Fauquier, and of course, if you go in further into Prince William and Fairfax, any type of a permit becomes, almost an unbearable understanding process. In Fauquier County, if you want to do an administrative subdivision, administrative division, cut one lot off of a property, you have to fill out an 58-page booklet. And, so all of a sudden, something that should cost you $1,000, $2,000 or $3,000 becomes a $15,000 project. So we've tried here in Rappahannock County not to go down that rat hole and allow people. Sometimes they provide us with good drawings, good graphics, and sometimes it's not as good. Other times we've recognized that an application has reached a level of complexity where they need to bring in an engineer surveyor and ask for more detailed site plans. So whatever we do here, I don't want to see we develop a bureaucracy here that takes a citizen weeks and months to put together and creates a frustration against the government here in Rappahannock County.
Good point. Really good point.
So that is a great point. I assume the Berkley Group, if you've had a chance to look at the ordinance, maybe knows what we're talking about, but just in a very brief summary is the Planning Commission has what several of us apparently consider kind of a head scratcher process, which is that we require applicants to come in for either an SUP or a special exception for a preliminary review. And what our ordinance says is that the preliminary review stage is for us to examine the completeness of the application. And then we have the option of holding a public hearing, but we make recommendations on the application to either the BZA or the Board of Supervisors. So in fact, there are 3 potential steps. And I think there's a general sense, probably among everybody, that that's excessive. And the question is, which stages do we drop off, since that's excessive? And I guess my question has always been, what value does the Planning Commission add to these? If it's something that just can go on to the BZA and the board, you could conceivably just have the staffer do it for completeness, as you say, have in the ordinance what should be in there and have it complete, have the staff do the checklist, and you could bypass the Planning Commission conceivably if there was no value added. So I assume at one point, at least, there was an assumption that the Planning Commission did add value. I personally find the completeness review for the Planning Commission as a superfluous step. I don't see any value in that. In practice, what happened, as I've seen it, is an applicant comes in, they present you or their attorney what's already in their application, which we could have read anyway. They tell it to us over again, and because we haven't advertised it for a public hearing, we don't have anybody else half the time telling us anything else about it. And so we just are like, well, that sounds good, and so we pass it on. But I don't feel personally that I can make any kind of real recommendation based just on one side presenting it to me. So my feeling has either been cut us out or just go straight to the public hearing before the Planning Commission, so we can at least hear from the public, apply the comprehensive plan, the planning aspect that I assume the Planning Commission is supposed to add to the process. And then that gives a meaningful recommendation to the deciding body. So that would be the way I've always thought it would be better, but it's certainly not the way it's written.
That is more in alignment with what we see in other localities. I'm sure Rebecca can weigh in on that as well. But typically we see the staff providing the application completeness review. There may be an opportunity, if the applicant so desires, for a work session with Planning Commission prior to public hearing. For instance, if there's specific density feedback that they want to discuss with you outside of the public hearing process. And usually that's we typically see that as voluntary versus a required step in the process.
You've Alvin Henry again. You've touched on one thing there. You mentioned the word staff, and our zoning staff is one person, and so she has a lot of responsibilities, multiple hats that she wears, and I don't think Fauquier County, I think they got 42 people in their zoning department. So I think with the vision of Rappahannock, knowing the government, knowing the citizens out here, I don't see us creating a big zoning staff here. So I think our zoning staff is going to stay one person, maybe two. So with all these hats, I think we have to, again, here too, look at simplicity in the construction and revamping of what we're doing here too.
I will just say that Rebecca and I both came from small planning staffs at the local government level, so we can relate to that and certainly keep that in mind as well. It's often prepping the materials for a meeting is just as difficult as actually reviewing the application itself too.
Great. Anyone else on this question of procedures, process?
One thing I do think is that it's useful for the Planning Commission to see what kinds of applications are coming in and who's making them, because it really affects the way we might want to do the zoning, or it affects the way that we see that the current zoning is working, and whether or not you render an opinion about it. But I think it is useful information.
This is Rick Kohler. One small thing is that there are divisions made in the county by right. They're approved by the zoning administrator. The Planning Commission never sees those, and we don't really have a grasp on what's happening in parts of the county. So it might be something that you might include in your thought process. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. And somewhat related to that last comment, this is Kier. One thing that we seem buried in meeting after meeting, and I'm not saying that we should necessarily change this, but it would be, I think, useful to hear from you all as you dig into possible revisions of how we handle different kinds of permits. We hear more tourist home applications than anything else. Tourist home or temporary rentals, or however you want to characterize them, less than 30-day rentals, Airbnb, VRBO type rentals. And on the one hand, they're oftentimes very sensitive because they're embedded within those applications, potential and uses, potential adverse effects on neighbors. On the other hand, I don't know, I mean, maybe 60% of the applications we heard last year or more were tourist home applications. And so the question is, how do we, one, make sure that those are vetted carefully? Two, when we only have one staff person, how do we make sure those are vetted carefully if we went sort of the administrative review route rather than a special use permit route? And three, if we keep those as special use permit applications, how do we kind of streamline the process so that the Planning Commission, the Board of Zoning Appeals are not preoccupied completely with those types of applications and missing, or not necessarily missing other big picture things, but I mean, Planning Commission has a broader role than just meeting after meeting and hearing tourist home applications. So I think that's one area that would be worth looking at. How do we streamline that whole review process, but protect our citizens? And I'm sure there are other examples within our special use and special exception permit categories that could be handled differently than we're currently handling them.
Thank you for that, because it's a good point too. And back to this question about having, only one staff person, that's exactly right. But again, we've got two processes in the Planning Commission. So, again, my own personal view of it has been, although, hopefully it will give us some good feedback, is that at a public hearing stage, we could do a completeness review as well as part of the public hearing. But a lot of times I just find that unless we're hearing from the neighbors or other people in the community, we just don't have a full, we don't have a full picture to make any kind of meaningful recommendation, as I said. So I would be interested in hearing what other communities tend to do on this, whether they bypass the planning commission, whether they just do a completeness review, whether they do a public hearing. How do they do it? What is considered the role of the planning commission in these applications? And again, what value or time saving can be added by having, is our ordinance not clear enough that it leads to ambiguity, that costs us time? Just recommendations of that sort.
All right, thank you. I think I've got an understanding and a feel. It's a little variety in the room on stance on this one, and that's okay. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken that has something that they want to add for this particular question before we move on? All right, so let's take a look at the next question. Are the district densities, lot sizes, setbacks appropriate to meet community goals? Are we, happy? We're not interested in changing any of those district standards, or maybe there's, some that there's been some issues. Maybe there's lots of variance requests or something like that going on.
So I'll jump in on this one if I may. This is Gary. I think one aspect of our ordinance is, and it relates to this question of density and lot size. Theoretically, our ordinance allows for a certain amount of clustering, of residences on a larger parcel to kind of facilitate both maybe improved benefits of kind of closer community of residences while preserving a larger agricultural space. And while I think there's a lot of different views on what exactly is allowable through our kind of rather dense and complicated combination of ordinances on this regard, it certainly isn't at all clear what kind of clustering or variations could be had, and this was also something that I think came was evidenced by the rezoning application that Keir mentioned earlier. Our tools by virtue of having a separate zoning decision, which in this case would have allowed a parcel to be divided into smaller parts, was really independent of the plat and layout kind of provisions that one might expect for some kind of village-based kind of boundary development. And there was a lot of discussion throughout that process about what was possible and what might happen and what could be done down the road. The decision space that we had, at least with the application of our ordinance, was 1 per 5 or 1 per 2, and that was a pretty blunt instrument. I think that many of us felt we could have perhaps moved that forward if we had a little bit more subtlety in our tools, and there's a lot in that, and there's a lot that's kind of hidden in the weird interplay of our density and our zoning ordinances. But I think this idea of kind of clustering and doing something other than equating a 25-acre density with a bunch of 25-acre single house site is, to me, the biggest shortcoming of the way our kind of residential zoning is set up right now.
Thanks, Gary. Anyone else?
I think, Alvin Henry, I think our ag zoning and the division process under the ag zoning is pretty well thought out, and it has some land use items in there. In that, of course, we have a density of, it's pretty easy to tell people, explain the density to them. If you got a perfect piece of land, 100 acres in size, you've got 4 division rights, and you can basically do 4 lots of any lot size down to 2 acres. If you want to do 3 2 acres and then a 94 acre lot, you can do that, or any combination thereof if you got a perfect site. But then if you move away from that perfect site and introduce topo or floodplains, then your density ability is decreased. So in an effort to protect these fragile lands and to allow people to have some rights with their property, I think the zoning density for the ag land is pretty clear. Now when you move into the R5 and the RRs around the villages, you have more issue. In Rappahannock County, you have one community that has public sewer, and that's Sperryville, but there's no public water in any of the communities in Rappahannock County. So any ability to do any density in these areas is really handicapped by the lack of utilities, and there's really no prospect to add any public water or any more public sewer in the county. So you're going to end up with lot sizes of some sort that have to support drain fields, and you have to recognize that the ability to do a traditional cluster in residential areas like you would see in other surrounding counties and give bonuses and things like that. I don't think that process would really work in Rappahannock County because of the lack of utilities. And if you look at the zoned area around the villages, it's limited, and you got to face reality. There's probably there's no political support, which was demonstrated by the Sperryville episode this past year, to increase the density around the villages. So that's an important thing to recognize that going forward. And I don't see public sentiment in support of additional residential areas changing, and it's going to be against it. So you got to realize that.
Good. Gary, Craig, I just want to point out one thing that you should definitely put in your notes, and that is that our rezoning process does not require a preliminary plat. And so that's what came up during this recent rezoning in Sperryville that Mr. Henry just noted. Now, an applicant could proffer a plat, but we can't force them to proffer a plat during rezoning. But we could require a preliminary plat that would then be linked to some future subdivision process at the time of a rezoning. And then relative to density, it works very, very well for subdivision. Everybody can comprehend the scenario that Mr. Henry just said. You have a 100-acre parcel and you can divide it up. But when you apply those densities to zoning, it gets very confusing. Are we talking about the parcel, or are we talking about what was the parent parcel? If I can put one house per 25 in agriculture, and I've happened to have a 25-acre lot, but it was carved out of 100. Do I get 3 houses? Is it based on the parent? Is it based on my parcel? And it gets confusing very quickly when you try to apply densities to zoning as opposed to just the minimums. If you have 2 acres, you get a house, and that's what you're allowed. But once density throws in, you might be taking a building lot away from your neighbor, and it's very confusing.
And that has happened in Rappahannock County. There have been properties that have been robbed. There's been large properties, particularly in Amosville, where you had a 100-acre parcel bigger, where the person was the first one that bought a lot off a big farm, and they sat on it and built a house and lived there for 40 years. And then somebody used up all these division rights next door, and they get sick and go try to make a lot, and they can't do nothing. So they have to sell the whole farm. And I think one thing that I have said a couple times, there's been no support to it. The date to establish division rights go back to what, 1962?
Before the subdivision ordinance.
Yeah, and we absolutely need to update that. That needs to be updated to a current date. it may give a few people a few more rights, but it makes this whole process easier. There's less likely of mistakes being made in determination, and it requires the zoning administrator basically to do a title search on every property going back 60 years. And I don't, I think we're not throwing anything out if we update that date to a more current date.
That comes up in the family divisions, which inexplicably is covered in both the zoning ordinance and the subdivision ordinance and our ordinances, so that you need to look at that as well.
It comes up in regular division too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask, it's possible that I'm just so this, I apologize for coming in a minute or two late. I sort of wanted to understand, I was a little confused by this question. I wanted to understand better the scope of what we're asking the Berkley Group to do here. We have, how much money do we have?
All the money.
All the money in the world?
1.5.
So I had understood that we were going to be looking at the telecommunications ordinance, subdivision ordinance, certainly, but I assumed that was for missing legal requirements and recommendations for additional, kind of protective measures. To look at that is certainly legitimate. Renewable energy, and events and tourist homes and things like that. But this question, are the district densities, lot sizes, and setbacks appropriate to meet community goals? That strikes me as a hugely broad question. And again, while it's there's a lot that can be said there, and probably a lot of different opinions in the community and on the planning commission and on the board of BZA, I feel like that's a little bit broader than I thought we were going to be addressing here. So I just wonder where we were.
Well, it's at risk of speaking for the Berkley Group or anybody else. If the Berkley Group asks that question of a planning commission of 7 members, and 7 members tell them absolutely it's wrong and that we need to do something about it, it better be in the report. Now, I don't think they're going to come back and tell Rappahannock County, your densities are wrong and you really need to consider these other densities because we know more about your densities than you know about your densities. But it's an important question to ask to understand what what's the datum from which they're working.
So just to be clear, the first step of this process, and I think it's a sensible one, is they're conducting this diagnostic initially, which is the timeline they set forth at the outset of the meeting. And so the diagnostics then can lead us into, I think, and I'll let them speak for themselves, but prioritization of what we're going to tackle first. And so these broader questions relate to sort of our starting point, which is a broader diagnostic review to figure out where we have holes and where there could be cleanup, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think both gentlemen said it wonderfully. And that's precisely what we're doing. We're just trying to lay some groundwork here so that we know where to focus our efforts, and where, there might be holes. Hey guys, can you, Berkley Group, take a look at this? This has been a concerns for us. And so these are just broad questions to help you all say, yes, this is where we have an issue. Look here, look there. And then it helps us once we start looking in there, we can make recommendations based on what we've heard from you all and based on what we see. But we're not going to be making recommendations on, oh, your ag district should have lot sizes of this. But we are setting up so that when you're ready to do your zoning ordinance, right, that you can look at these items and say, okay, these are all items that came up and this is where we want to focus, and then dive deeper into, okay, if some particular district was mentioned, should we have another conversation about particular lot size or setback or division rights and those types of things. So this is the groundwork that will start the bigger work of rewriting later.
Anyone else on this very important question, density, setbacks, et cetera? Steph, do you have anything? Not to put you on the spot, but okay. And I should mention to our Berkley Group friends that we have 2 attorneys on the planning commission. So it's Miss Ritter and Miss Ishii are both attorneys. So
Recovering attorneys.
what's that? Yeah, they're recovering, right? But anyway, it's great to have them both on here. And Ms. Ritter just joined us this year from the Board of Zoning Appeals. So I think we're all grateful for their legal insight and acumen. Should we move on to the next question?
Yes, let's move on.
Yeah,
So next one, which we have touched on a little bit, is the distinction between special exception and special use permits. And so we just want to kind of clearly understand, when do you feel like it should be a special exception and when should be a special use? Just kind of explaining a little bit for us so that when we're looking at that list, we can clearly see what you guys see.
Well, I mean, when I joined the Board of Supervisors, my first question was, what's the difference? And I don't know that, I mean, Mr. Curry did a good job of explaining it. And it seems like the way this bifurcated system has evolved is that special exceptions have broader community countywide implications, maybe.
I think at one point in time, that might have been the intent, that a special exception could have a greater possibility of impacting the broader community, whereas a special use permit might impact a small area of community. But that gets a little bit mixed up when you think about short-term rentals, where a short-term rental might impact a neighborhood, but 100 short-term rentals might affect the rental market in the community.
Right.
So it's not always simple. Which is why we have 7 brilliant people in the planning commission.
Well, my answer to that question is the distinction is completely transparent to my view of the applications. I think it was based on a matter of convenience for the Board of Supervisors to delegate some of this responsibility. There was an attempt a few years ago to actually eliminate this distinction, and it became kind of a turf issue where members of one body didn't want to give up authority, and so to me this is outside of our jurisdiction. I wish it would go away. It makes no sense to me, and there's really no distinction from my point of view.
I'll just say I understand the theory behind it. For me, it's always a mystery as to, I think it seems fairly random. And I know when we were rewriting some other ordinance language earlier this year, and it was suggested to be a special permit or a special exception, and I asked, or somebody asked why, and it was like, well, we could have put it in the other body, and there didn't seem to be
something to do.
Yeah, there didn't seem to be any really consistent distinction. So it strikes me as a little random sometimes, I admit.
Critically, the voters have access to the Board of Supervisors, and they don't have access to the BZA, and that's important for the citizens to understand.
Well, the BZA also has a kind of quasi-judicial function too, and
well, their variances and appeals, that's their core function.
So I don't really understand why something would go, and I don't feel as a body we need to have a grasp on why something should go to one versus the other. But if there's a good reason for that, and Berkley Group knows a really good, clear reason for that, I'm sure that would be helpful to know.
I think originally there was sort of a notion between the more technical questions that were more about expertise and whether something followed certain rules that could be more conveniently covered by the BZA, and those that were somewhat more kind of political and broader brush. But again, that is such a, if it ever had any real purchase or relevance, I think it's been either lost or found to be a pipe dream that you could make such distinctions between these different types of uses.
And so beyond the special use permits, how active is the BZA with other requests and things like that? Or is it they're active because they're getting so many of these special permit requests?
it's mostly special use requests and the occasional variance, but not that often on the variance.
So Michelle, over the last couple of years, how many variances and appeals do you recall?
3 appeals and maybe a handful of variances, about 5.
Over how long since you've been here?
Yeah.
So 4 years?
Yep.
How many is that?
I think 3 appeals and about 5 variances.
Most of which are variances are dead from the start, just by the state code, so.
Right.
And that's, there's misunderstanding it.
All right, so let's take a look then at the next question and tell me, are there any particular uses that do jump out at you as, this doesn't have to be a special use. It doesn't have to go to the BZA. We approve these all the time. They have lots of the same conditions. This could be a by right and include those conditions as use performance standards. Are there any things like that jump out immediately at you?
Tourist homes. Yeah, I mean, we're getting those in, and we just review, there's not usually much discussion about it. This is the
And the group, the BZA and the Planning Commission, a couple years ago, looked into the continuum of tourist home, Airbnb, bed and breakfast, and various others. And there was some talk at that time about potentially creating more than one use for short-term rental. One might be an administrative approval if it's a caretaker on site or something like that. It got bogged down and didn't really make it out the end of the pipe. And so I think there might still be legs to some of those conversations. But there's significant citizen interest in the short-term rentals. So if there are scenarios where you would eliminate the public hearing process, it would have to be very clearly delineated on what makes those okay. Is it a very large parcel with a very long, big setback or yard requirement, and caretaker on site? So if you have 1,000 acres and your house is in the middle, nobody knows what's happening. You probably have people that are staying there now. Why do we care? But if you are 20 feet from your neighbor because of your grandfather, because your house is built in the 40s, and you're going to bring people over every weekend, maybe that's a different conversation. And you happen to live in DC and never come here. It's your third house. So I think there are some opportunities in that particular use, and that's by far the most heavily used special use, special exception.
And the world has changed, of course. We all look at Airbnbs when we go someplace, right? And Rappahannock's a prime location for an Airbnb, which is primarily what we're talking about when we say tourist homes, I think. And I'd be interested in hearing, what if any lessons you've learned from other jurisdictions on this, because I hear all over the map on, hey, these are great, it gives us more income than long-term rental does, to this is cutting down on affordable housing in the county because everybody's switching to Airbnbs instead of rentals, to, again, on a big parcel, it's no big deal because it's not affecting the neighbors, but on a little parcel it is, versus what is this doing to the rental market? So I'd love to hear if any.
Yeah, I would too. The rental market issue is huge because there's really not much affordable housing available that's for rent, never mind to buy. And so many of these what would otherwise be rental properties are Airbnb because you can make a lot more money.
I think another aspect of these Airbnb, and I'm sorry, I'm assuming that was a question to be answered throughout the course of this project, not necessarily at this minute, but if you want to answer it, I'll stand down. But I didn't want to lose sight of what I think is often the challenge of these tourist homes that hasn't been raised yet, and that is when they're not on public roads, or they're on private lanes that are shared by others. We have provisions that are used to be that it was just based on the width of the right of way, which was kind of a surrogate for the quality and safety of the road, but it really wasn't a very good indication of the quality and safety of the road because there were plenty of right of ways that weren't built out in a way that allowed for turnout lanes and visibility and the like. And so in our most recent revisions, we actually swung in the other direction and now have a pretty high road standard requirement. And I think we're still trying to, frankly, understand the implications of that change because, those standards are hard to, it's not always clear for a given, non-public secondary or tertiary road whether it meets the road specs, because we did those sort of by reference. So I feel like that's an area where, on the one hand, we did do something, we made some progress on that, but I still feel like we might have solved part of one problem and added to another one in the decision that we made there, because to figure out what that road, what condition or what standard the road meets is not something that is easy for applicants to do. And we haven't had a whole lot of data on that, but it's something that I think is worth noting in this area of tourist homes. We have a lot of properties that are very private on very private lanes, and many of the concerns that are raised are about the traffic and the lost person, and the fact that, well, on the one hand, they're not going to know where they're going, but on the other hand, we don't want a bunch of signs on our private driveway and that sort of thing. So to me, that is the that's the other factor, along with lot size and kind of impact on rental markets that we see in these things.
Good, very good. Anything agritourism, farm winery, farm brewery, distillery, etc., syncing what we have in our ordinance with state requirements and providing as strong a restrictions as we're allowed to do up to the safety, health, etc., and usual and customary, and helping us frame that out. That's a critical need. And whether any of those uses might, in areas where they're not automatically allowed by right by Code of Virginia, making sure that there's appropriate SE or SUP, probably SE, process for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge area for us, and it's I think right now we're truly lacking, to use Gary Light's term, lacking tools from a zoning perspective to limit operations of agritourism, farm winery type businesses. In most cases, it's fine, but we have instances of no evidence of bona fide agricultural operations, and yet people are able to hide behind the agritourism provision of state code to do all kinds of things. So it's really an area of focus. And I think I'm glad we're talking now with the Berkley Group, because this question is coming up repeatedly, and it's becoming an accelerated concern for us to address.
Not to take more than my space, but I want to also just add on to that I think the particular aspect that we deal with and are very concerned about and have, I think our ordinance falls very short on, is the regulation of event venue space. Our ordinance is awkwardly written, and it seems to focus entirely on the possibility that individual events are permitted, and there's very little provision for a use that is intended to have regular or irregular or some frequency of gatherings of people for various purposes. And that's often caught up in this agritourism use, but it's not limited to that use because of our scenery, because of the desire to have events, and the fact that we have a lot of open space here, everything from kind of music festivals to wedding venues to, automobile kinds of activities, various hobby kinds of gatherings. Those are all things that, we see in various forms, and I don't think our ordinance is very helpful in sorting those out in meaningful ways to manage the kind of harmony of the surrounding communities.
Yeah, and Gary, I'm glad you brought that up. Rebecca, Kelly, and Chris, you'll see, and you might have already seen in our ordinance, that events are handled in several different ways throughout our ordinance. And one of the priority items on our sort of queue of areas that we want to dig into before enlisting your help was sort of harmonization of those disparate parts of the zoning ordinance, so that we actually had a coherent set of guidelines for events. And there have been some applications in the past that I think suffered because of really our poor ordinance language that we could have addressed more thoughtfully had we had better guidelines available to us. So that is definitely a priority area. Well, there are lots of priorities, but that's one we definitely don't want to lose track of in this process.
Yeah, and on that too, when you're looking through this technically, so we did address some of these issues when we did our recent amendments to the ordinance on tourist homes, but there's still inconsistencies when you look at the definitions of, hotels, motels, and even then sometimes there's overlap even with some of that with conference centers and resorts and country clubs and country inns, and there's just a lot of confusion and definitions and application when you actually look at it. So yeah, that would be great.
And that's probably going to be a follow-on item after you finish your diagnostic. Note that as the agritourism, a few of the others that we really need to look at in our next cycle of work starting in July.
Since this is Brian, since you specifically asked if there was any uses that should be removed or allowed, I found one this weekend. We don't even have a definition for it. The adult farm labor camp. That seems to be kind of a throwback to.
That Brian brings a good point. There are several uses in the use table in 170-36 that do not have accompanying definitions.
Yeah.
So we resort to common definitions as is required. And so if it's important enough to be in the use table, it probably ought to have a definition.
I figure
to fit what we want it to be.
Because my children are adults.
So somewhere along the line, Fauquier or Fairfax County, whoever we stole this ordinance from, thought that was an important use.
I can see that at a time when apples were
Right.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Rebecca, Kelly, Chris, where are we now in this set of really good questions, by the way? You can see that this has got us off and running pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a full page of notes already, so good stuff.
Good.
Then I think we can move to the next set of questions. And so our site design requirements, such as parking, buffering, lighting, adequate for development. So, you mentioned that you don't have a lot of commercial or industrial areas, but in those areas or in places where you're seeing, one use that backs up to another use that are different from each other, do you feel like the buffering between those is sufficient? Are parking for uses sufficient or too much? Some localities, that's what we've seen. Years ago, it was, you've got to have plenty of parking. And we're seeing now that can be reduced. So what are you guys seeing and thinking about those types of standards?
But we don't do development, so it almost never comes up. I think the bank was the last real site development project. And it's also in what you need to pay attention to is the highway, general overlay corridor or something like that. 170/45, I think it is. And so there are some special design requirements in that small overlay district, which has some special landscaping and whatnot. But we have done in 4 years, no real full-fledged major site plans. We've had one brewery in Sperryville that did do an engineering site plan, but it's so small that there's not much to it, as opposed to many of the other localities you work where there's half a dozen or a dozen site plans in process at any given time, working its way through the system. So I don't think anybody really knows whether these standards are adequate for lighting. You should know that dark skies is important to most folks out here. And so full cutoff optics and things like that are important. If it's not already in the ordinance, probably should be. And that goes for signs as well as
Rick, do you want to weigh in
lighting.
Weigh in on what?
Dark skies.
Dark skies?
Yeah.
Well, right now, I'm with the Environmental Protection League, but our big concern is there's a big development at Clevenger's Corner just to our east in Culpeper County, which we have no control over really, and that could brighten our skies. But in general, I think the public supports dark skies here, and we have a program to replace lights for free. So I don't know what else to say about it. Really.
Yeah, and I following up on both of those, from my perspective, since we don't see it very often, if you just happen in your review to come across something like, whoa, you guys ought to be aware that you're allowing something that's going to be really inconsistent with your comprehensive plan, perhaps buried in our subdivision orders, for example, which we rarely look at because we have a reason to. That would be helpful to me, but it just doesn't. I haven't seen it come up a lot, and hope it doesn't.
And I'll say this is a question too that when I was drafting it, I thought they might not have a lot to say about this.
That's okay.
Yeah, but Article 13 performance standards and Article 10 off-street loading and off-street parking 9. The most they've come up is when that I recall when people have reached out to us and said, well, what can I do with this old building over here? And I want to make it apartments or whatever. And so then it's a code review to determine, well, if it's apartments, then you X number of parking spaces, and usually the project doesn't go anywhere and we move on, and somebody else contacts us a year later.
I think one other thing that is a concern is that at some point, development is moving this way all the time, and eventually they'll be big. Some deep-pocketed person will come in here and challenge our zoning, and we're not going to have the money to fight it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that we do want to be prepared, our zoning to be prepared to at least substantiate that we do have some affordable housing, we do have things that are required, and whatever else is required, we need it in there so that we at least have a leg to stand on.
Right, and I think that goes back to our early discussion about sort of this basic principle in the comp plan about concentrating growth. I hate to use that word, but development, also hate to use that word. Whatever word you want to use around the town, in and around the town of Washington, our county seat, and the villages, and that is something we have to take seriously because it one keeps the rest of the county wide open, and two, I'm not the lawyer here, but suggests that at least we're, as Rick pointed out, taking care of the affordable housing obligation and not being so exclusive that someone could challenge us in court.
I think another topic that might be worth bringing up in the site design space is the topic of noise in general. It's not something we address too generally, but it comes up a lot. It comes up in the events with respect to music. It comes up in some of the, shooting, firearms related uses that have come up, and neighbors have complained about, noise levels. It's come up in some of the animal, certainly the kennel discussions and dog training facilities, concerns about the noise. And again, I don't, it's a case of be careful what you ask for, but I do think noise comes up as a general condition, and we tend to use surrogates and inexact things. I don't, we don't address it, I don't think, in a very consistent manner at all times, but I would say that is a topic that we do discuss a fair amount in various contexts.
And you will see that for 170-117 does allow the Planning Commission and BZA board to tackle noise when it comes to SEs, SUPs. There is no county noise ordinance outside of this limited protection. And that is by design. It's been discussed and not deemed appropriate for our community.
So that might be one challenge for the agritourism, because with agritourism, you can't regulate noise any more than you do in your countywide noise ordinance. And so that might be a reason to revisit that discussion, but we can make that connection in the report.
Okay.
Back on the topic, I don't mean to ignite a firestorm here, because it is obviously a topic that we all in the county are concerned about. But back to the topic of, our zoning and defensibility. Seems to me that, if we can look at certain areas and just make of our ordinance, there are, as I said, a few that we know are not compliant with the code right now. But if there's anything that's not compliant, as you've already said, you look at with the Virginia code, that's important to know. I don't suppose we're looking at, defensibility of our entire code, although I certainly agree with Rick, because that's a deep issue.
I'm having trouble hearing because of some paper rustling or something. Can you say that again?
That was our zoning amendment.
We got a chipmunk down here in the plastic.
Somebody's hungry, that's all.
I am hungry.
Okay, I've moved the mic closer. Anyway, that's just a very complicated topic. On affordability, we have when I talked to our county commissioner, certainly on a rental basis, 75% of our housing is valued at $300,000 less. So that was several months ago. And we have a small county, and most of it, a good part of it, that zone residential is not built on. So in terms of defending our zoning, I think we have plenty of basis for defending our zoning. And so I wouldn't want to get down that rabbit hole too much, I guess is all I'm saying on that, worrying about that. I think there are some really specific things that we can correct throughout, but that's a great thing to keep in mind though, too. I don't disagree with that.
We're looking for a guarantee that we'll never be sued. So if you could just include that in your scope of work. Okay, so we touched that one pretty lightly, and we're on to, I think, item G, and I think we've already hit on some of these general themes that are important, at least in our minds, that we address. Again, agritourism, farm wineries, bona fide agricultural operations, I think customary, what's the phrase I always forget? Usual and customary uses associated with agritourism or farm winery operations. That's top of my list, and I'll let other people chime in.
Where you kicked off on the comp plan was updated significantly into telecommunications, vertical assets, and that needs to make its way over to the zoning ordinance, as well as aligning it with the 2018 code changes, which we haven't kept up with.
Utility scale solar, huge thing. We have something on the books, as we mentioned, but we need to address that sooner rather than later. Make sure that we're we're straight vis-a-vis state code.
You know, one of the things that I worry about, which is just a general worry, but most of our county is either conservation or agriculture, which is what we want. But agriculture is a really tough haul now. It's really hard to make a living at agriculture. And I was thinking about what we need to do is to figure out what are the values that we're trying to preserve with agricultural zoning if agriculture is not a viable enterprise. And then if we figure out what those values are, how can we preserve those through other kinds of enterprises on that same land?
And that is a comprehensive plan concept that, you know, if the community gets around that sort of thing, then how do you trickle that down into your zoning ordinance?
Yeah.
It really was.
And have we done it now? But, you know, short-term rentals is one way that a large acreage owner might be able to get a little revenue to keep from chopping up his land.
Yeah.
Or her land.
Right.
And, you know, again, these are very broad questions and lots to think about. No, it's good to raise them and think about it. I mean, for example, and Gary, maybe you can correct me or somebody else. As I understand it, we have ag use special tax status, but we don't have open space special tax.
Correct.
So some jurisdictions do have that, and just for maintaining, if I understand it correctly, open space, you know, you get a tax break. We don't allow that in this county, for example. So there probably are tools out there that we could also help landowners utilize, whether those are ones that the county would want.
Yeah.
You know, they haven't chosen to use that in the past.
Does Rappahannock allow for that if it actually isn't a qualified easement?
So obviously there are conservation easements, which are a little bit different. But in the land use program, yeah, in the land use program, we do allow agriculture, horticulture, and forestry, but not open space. And so we could add open space into that mix, and it could be taxed at a different rate. There's a lot of debate over pros and cons on whether that makes sense or not, and whether it would cause more people to protect their land, or maybe it would, all these people who are in forestry now who actually have a forestry management plan would then, you know, would let go of that. And so all these rolling hills you see that are maintained for hay could turn into saplings.
Yeah.
And is that what you want? So,
Yeah, and we need.
but that's not a zoning thing. So,
It doesn't help our budget either.
Yeah.
well, it might, but you know.
Right.
Great.
So I was just going to ask, is there anything else that I haven't asked, or anything pressing related to your subdivision ordinance, your zoning ordinance, that you just want to share with us tonight? And then we can wrap up.
When we talked earlier, the subdivision ordinance, for all practical purposes, is not used. It probably ought to be able to be used should somebody really want to do that. But the family divisions is in that section is used, and then the boundary line adjustments and limited divisions that are administratively approved by the zoning administrator or subdivision agent in that case. But the rest is really not used. I don't know when this community has ever done a fully reviewed subdivision with preliminary final plat, the whole thing.
I think Flint Hill back 15, 20 years ago, across some settles.
Okay.
They actually drilled wells to do drawdowns.
Yep. So that's, you know, context.
Yeah.
We might have done it in Sperryville if that rezoning went through, and they could still do it now with just the existing zoning.
We've got the trailer park down in Amesville.
That was probably there before zoning and just was zoned for that.
The same buildings.
Mosby stayed there.
Chester Gap versus well.
Did you know that? Mosby stayed there.
All right. So Berkley Group team, I guess we'll send it back to you to walk us through next steps, and then hopefully we can meet you somewhere in the middle and figure out what we're going to do next and when we're going to meet with you next.
Yeah, so we have kind of checked off the first two things, basically kick off with staff and kick off with planning commission. And we're going to start drafting our diagnostic of the zoning ordinance, subdivision ordinance, and land use report. And then we will meet back with you guys in May, in which time you'll have all of those documents in hand. We'll walk you through them briefly, highlighting some of what's in there, and then also allow you time to ask us questions about what we've reported. And then we'll also do that with the Board of Supervisors.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. I think everyone would agree. It's reassuring to have your help, and it's really also great to hear all my colleagues on the Planning Commission and their different perspectives on our very unique county. And it's clear that you appreciate how unique Rappahannock County is. And I'm sure other people in other counties tell you their counties are unique, but they're not compared to us. We're more unique. So thank you for just indulging us in that regard, because it is important and we want to keep this place the way it is. Speaking of indulging, I wonder if I could indulge the Berkley Group. We have one member of the public, Ms. Barsky, who is here, and we do have a public comment agenda item. And Ms. Barsky is one of my constituents, and she and her husband, Mr. Nash, are very hands-on and attentive to all things zoning, and for some unfortunate reasons in particular. But I just want to at least invite Ms. Barsky, if you have anything you want to say. The microphone there is yours.
Thank you.
And thank you. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you. So my name is Yoko Barsky. I'm living in the Hampton District. And first of all, congratulations to all of you for launching this meeting and starting to tackle this enormous project. And I think with the Berkley Group's help, I think you will probably go through it very well. And the Rappahannock is a very, very special place with all the rural characteristics, and everybody here I talk to, all the residents want to preserve what it is now. And that's a big task. Yeah. And three members of this the Berkley Group, I'm sure you have worked with a lot of rural counties in Virginia. I would actually like to know which counties that they have dealt with in regard to these ordinances. So we can go back and actually look at their ordinances, and maybe we can learn from there. So I would really appreciate if those three members could tell us some backgrounds and which counties that they have worked in mostly rural Virginia. I don't think we need to know that you worked on Alexandria, but some rural counties in Virginia. I'd really appreciate that.
That's a great question. Would you mind just touching on some of your past experience, just so we can all benefit from that?
Sure. So from an we have worked in many localities across Virginia. Some of our recent ordinances that are either close to adoption or have recently been adopted would be King William County and Essex County. Those are actually on a little further east than you all, but those would be two that I would say are fairly recent examples of rural localities that we've worked with.
Okay,
And
great.
you're working with Page County as well, doing similar analysis?
Yes, we have worked with Page County as well. And we're also working with Albemarle County on their zoning ordinance update.
So King William, Essex, Page, Albemarle are the ones that they
Okay,
just.
I'll ask you. Okay,
Good.
and all three of you did the same thing, and you're all planners.
I'm sorry, did you ask what our background was?
Are there different perspectives from the different members of Berkley Group? Did you work on different projects.
Yes, certainly. I can give a little background about the Berkley Group to kick us off. Well, to close us out, I guess, rather. But the Berkley Group was started by Darren Coffey and Drew Williams, who both came from long careers in local government here in Virginia from a planning and public works perspective. And the team before you today is I'm the planning director with the Berkley Group, and I previously worked for the city of Manassas as a planner there. Rebecca is a former planning and zoning administrator from Buckingham County. She's principal planner and project lead for this effort. And Chris is a fairly new planner with us, joining us from Rockingham County as a former zoning technician. And so we do have diverse perspectives on the team. In addition to the team before you here, we have environmental planners, we have historic preservation planners, and so we also have some different what we call executive managers who are longtime retired planners that support the staff that you see before you in different capacities. So we have breadth on our team beyond just what you see here, but we're very happy to assist in this effort.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very much. And one other thing I wanted to point out to check the compliance with the Code of Virginia. At the last supervisors meeting, Mr. Goff, our county attorney, was supposed to give us his interpretation of several items that may or may not conform. And it never happened. Have any of you heard from Mr. Goff about that? Or is it anything that's been discussed after that?
I'm sure the Berkley Group has not heard from Mr. Goff.
Yeah,
And she's speaking about agritourism related state code.
And that needs to be, I think,
Yeah.
communicated with the Berkley Group, and also they need to be aware of all that, because that seems to be very complicated. And where does Mr. Goff stand on that right now?
He has authored I don't know if it's an opinion or a letter on that. It was actually done some time ago, and I'm not sure if that was ever published publicly or not, but we'll make sure that's shared at least during the next Board of Supervisors meeting.
That's great. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thanks a lot.
And congratulations and good luck.
Thanks for being here and for your enthusiasm.
If I may add one thing here.
Yeah, please.
This is Rick Kohler again. I just, it hasn't been said, but we do have a particular love of our mountains, and we have a lot of ridges, and I think that one of the major things that people care about is preserving these mountains, and that might be something you might put into the stew.
As Berkley Group, as you read the comprehensive plan, Rick is responsible for the term crests and ridges being included and reference to the state code on that. Who knew there were state code requirements in 15.2, 2200 on crests and ridges, but it's in there. So
good point, Rick.
And if I may, just as a follow-up to the question about our experience and then the follow-on about the attorney, I do just want to reiterate or make the Planning Commission aware that the Berkley Group is not, we are not land use attorneys, we are planners. And so when we do our state code analysis, we're not rendering legal opinions. We are giving you our planning expertise from what we have learned in throughout completing these zoning ordinance updates from other localities. So this is not a formal legal review. It's not a legal opinion. We do, as part of zoning ordinance updates, have partners that can perform a legal review that are land use attorneys and offer that. So, once we get into the next stage, that might be something that you want to consider, but I did just want to bring that up since there was a specific question about a legal opinion.
Yep, great, thank you.
Very clear in your scope of work.
Yep, thank you for that disclaimer. Great. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us tonight, Kelly, Rebecca, and Chris. And we know it's a Tuesday night, so we appreciate your flexibility in meeting with us after business hours. And obviously, we'll be in touch. And hopefully, you caught everyone's name, but we'll make sure that we get everyone's name and contact information to you, just so you can put names with faces. And thanks again very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks also
Thanks so
here and Gary, Hurry Gary Light for kind of spearheading this and putting it together. Appreciate all that thinking that went into that and organizing. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we'll go ahead, motion to adjourn our meeting.
So move.
I second.
Okay, any discussion? None. Thank you. Meeting adjourned. Thanks again.
Berkley Group folks, if you could, somebody could email the presentation to me, I can upload it to BoardDocs so that we have a record of what you did.
Sure, I'll do that.
All right, thank you, bye.
Thanks.
Yes.